Between 1970 and 1979, American families exposed their children to more unregulated chemicals, unrestrained car rides, and unsupervised chaos than any generation before or since. And nobody blinked. Here are 30 funny things our grandparents did in the 1970s that we somehow forgot. If you walked into any suburban living room in the 1970s, your feet disappeared. Shag carpet, thick, deep pile, sometimes 3 inches long, covered floors in every shade. Nature never intended, from burnt orange to avocado green to a brown that matched absolutely nothing. Your grandparents did not just carpet the living room, they carpeted the kitchen, they carpeted the dining room, they carpeted the bathroom walls. Maintaining it required a special carpet rake, because standard vacuums could not reach the dirt, coins, food crumbs, and small toys buried in the pile. In bathrooms, that thick fiber sat in permanent humidity, quietly growing mold colonies behind the toilet that nobody discovered until the renovation decades later. Spilling anything, juice, wine, or soup, meant accepting the stain as a permanent roommate. And yet, every carpet store in America could not stock it fast enough. On a hot summer afternoon in 1974, no kid in America walked inside for a glass of water. You drank from the garden hose. You grabbed the green rubber hose coiled in the yard, turned the spigot, let the first blast of scalding water run out, and then drank straight from the nozzle while it poured down your chin and soaked your shirt. Nobody questioned it. Nobody tested the water. The hose itself was made with polyvinyl chloride stabilized with lead, and the brass fittings contained even more of it. A 2016 study found that water sitting in a standard garden hose in direct sunlight could contain lead levels 18 times higher than what the EPA considers safe for drinking. The rubber also leached antimony, bromine, and organotin compounds when heated by the sun. Your grandparents handed you that hose every single day of every single summer and told you to hydrate. In 1975, a man named Gary Dahl sat in a bar in Los Gatos, California, and convinced himself that Americans would pay $3.95 for a pet rock. Not a polished gem, not a carved sculpture. A smooth stone from Rosarito Beach in Baja, Mexico, packaged in a cardboard box with air holes punched in the side, sitting on a nest of straw like a living creature. It came with a 32-page instruction manual that taught owners how to train their rock to sit, stay, and roll over. By Christmas of that year, Dahl was selling over 100,000 rocks a day and became a millionaire practically overnight. The fad collapsed by February of 1976, but during those few months, Americans spent more than $15 million on stones that did absolutely nothing. Your grandparents bought one. They probably still have it in a closet somewhere, still sitting, still staying, still doing exactly what it was designed to do. The station wagon was the undisputed family vehicle of the 1970s, and no seat in America was more coveted than the way back. The Ford Country Squire stretched nearly 19 feet long, got 8 to 10 miles per gallon, and featured a rear-facing third-row seat where kids sat backwards, staring at the traffic behind them, with no seat belts, no padding, and no barrier between their skulls and the rear window glass. The faux wood-grain vinyl paneling on the outside made it look like a house on wheels. On long family road trips, kids would sprawl across the cargo area with pillows and blankets, rolling freely from side to side on every turn, while their parents listened to AM radio up front. A sudden stop turned every loose child into a projectile. The way back had no crumple zone, no headrests, and sat directly against the tailgate. It was, by every modern engineering standard, the most dangerous seat in any car on the road, and every kid in America fought to sit there. Before avocado toast ever existed, avocado was strictly a color, and your grandparents put it on everything. The refrigerator was avocado green, the stove was avocado green, the dishwasher, the blender, the toaster, the toilet, and in some especially committed households, the bathtub. General Electric, Frigidaire, and Whirlpool all manufactured appliances in this shade throughout the decade, alongside its companion color, Harvest Gold. The two tones dominated American kitchens like a decorating virus that nobody wanted cured. Matching was not optional. If the fridge was avocado, the countertop had to be avocado, the curtains had to be avocado, and the shag carpet creeping in from the living room had better be avocado too. The color finally fell out of fashion by the early 1980s, but those appliances were built to last. Some ran for 30 years. You could not get rid of avocado green even when you wanted to. On warm summer evenings in neighborhoods across America, a slow-moving truck would roll down the street releasing massive clouds of chemical fog from a mounted sprayer, and kids would sprint out of their houses to chase it. They ran directly into the pesticide cloud, laughing and playing, breathing it deep into their lungs while their parents watched from the porch and waved. DDT had been banned for agricultural use by the EPA in 1972, but municipal mosquito spraying continued through the decade, using organophosphate replacements like malathion, which the World Health Organization later classified as probably carcinogenic to humans. No one told the kids to stay inside. No one closed the windows. The truck was a scheduled event, practically a neighborhood gathering, and the fog smelled like summer. Parents believed the spray kept mosquitoes away from their kids. It never occurred to anyone that the spray itself might be the bigger problem. Your grandmother owned a copper jello mold, and she used it for crimes against food that would be considered a violation of the Geneva Convention today. In the 1970s, gelatin was not dessert. It was architecture. The Joys of Jell-O recipe book, published by General Foods Corporation in 1967 and still in heavy rotation a decade later, contained instructions for tomato aspic with shrimp, lime gelatin salad with cottage cheese and canned pineapple, and a concoction called Perfection Salad that suspended shredded cabbage, celery, and olives in a trembling lemon mold. Ham went into gelatin. Tuna went into gelatin. Deviled eggs went into gelatin with mustard, mayonnaise, and bacon bits. These dishes showed up at church potlucks, holiday tables, and dinner parties where impressing the neighbors required a molded centerpiece that jiggled. The savory Jell-O trend finally collapsed in the late 1970s, but not before an entire generation learned to distrust anything that wobbled on a plate. Wood paneling was the design choice of the 1970s, and your grandparents nailed it to every vertical surface they could find. It was not real wood, but a thin artificial veneer over pressed particle board, dark enough to make any room feel like the inside of a cigar box. It covered living room walls, basement walls, bedroom walls, and in some houses, even the ceiling. The panels were glued and stapled directly over existing drywall, trapping moisture behind them and creating ideal conditions for mold growth that nobody discovered for years. The thin composition also made them a serious fire concern because the adhesives and particle board could ignite faster than solid wood and release toxic fumes when burning. Your grandparents paired this paneling with heavy floor-length drapes and shag carpet, essentially constructing a room out of the three most flammable decorating choices available. Today, home renovation shows feature the cathartic removal of these panels, usually followed by gasps when homeowners discover their rooms are twice as bright without them. In 1970, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act banned tobacco advertising on television and radio. It did absolutely nothing about where people actually smoked. Your grandparents lit cigarettes in restaurants while other families ate dinner 3 feet away. They smoked in movie theaters, in grocery stores, in office buildings, and in hospital waiting rooms where pregnant women sat breathing it in. Airplanes had smoking sections separated from non-smoking sections by nothing more than a row number, and the same recycled cabin air reached everyone equally. Doctors smoked in their own examination rooms. Teachers smoked in school lounges while students sat next door. Ashtrays were standard tableware placed next to the butter dish at dinner parties, and nobody questioned why the kids had chronic coughs every winter. The concept of secondhand smoke as a genuine health hazard did not gain mainstream traction until the Surgeon General's report in 1986. For the entire decade before that, every room in America was a smoking section. Seatbelt use was not federally mandated in the United States until 1984. For the entire 1970s, your grandparents drove with kids standing on the front bench seat, lying across the rear window shelf, climbing between rows, and playing on the floor during highway trips. Babies rode in their mothers' laps. Toddlers sat on father's knees and steered. Car seats existed, but were rare, flimsy, and not required by law in most states until the mid-1980s. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that proper restraints reduce fatal injury risk by 45% for front seat passengers. None of that data mattered in 1976. The dashboard was solid steel with no airbag, and the only safety device was your mother's arm swinging across your chest when she hit the brakes, a move every kid in America remembers and no engineer has ever endorsed. By 1977, over 20 million Americans owned a CB radio, and approximately none of them were professional truck drivers. The Citizens Band craze started when truckers used the radios to coordinate the 1973 highway strikes against fuel shortages and the new 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. Then, C.W. McCall released Convoy in 1975. It hit #1 on both the country and pop charts, and suddenly every dentist and accountant in the suburbs needed a handle and a base station. The FCC dropped the license fee from $40 to $4, and Radio Shack could not keep units on the shelves. Your grandfather picked a handle like Nighthawk or Silver Fox, learned to say 10-4 and Smokey with a Kodak, and spent his evenings talking to strangers on Channel 19 while your grandmother tried to watch television next door. By the early 1980s, the channels had devolved into profanity, and the novelty was gone. Millions of CB radios became garage sale clutter that nobody wanted at any price. Sometime around 1972, every married couple in suburban America decided that the height of sophistication was dipping bread into a communal pot of boiling cheese over an open flame in the middle of the living room. Fondue sets became the default wedding gift of the decade, a ceramic or metal pot, a ring of long-handled forks, and a small burner fueled by sterno or denatured alcohol that sat on the table between the cocktails and the ashtrays. The pot reached temperatures hot enough to cause serious burns. The sterno cans were open containers of flammable gel, sitting next to napkins and tablecloths, and the forks were sharp enough to qualify as a mild weapon in a room full of adults who had been drinking Harvey Wallbangers since 6. Your grandparents hosted these parties regularly, sometimes adding a second pot of hot chocolate for dessert, doubling the open flames on the table. The craze faded by the late 1970s, but the burn marks on the dining room table lasted considerably longer. The polyester leisure suit was the uniform of the 1970s, and your grandfather owned at least one in a color that should never have existed. These matching jacket and pant sets were made from 100% double-knit polyester, a synthetic fabric that did not breathe, did not absorb sweat, and melted on contact with open flame. The material would not wrinkle, which was its only selling point, because it also trapped body heat, turning every man at every party into a slowly poaching egg. Lee jeans introduced the Lee Sure suit in 1970, and by mid-decade, the style had conquered every department store in America. John Travolta wore a white one in Saturday Night Fever in 1977 and cemented the look forever. Some upscale restaurants posted signs refusing entry to men wearing them. The suits vanished almost overnight by 1980. The polyester is still intact in landfills, and it will remain for approximately 200 more years. They were called jarts, and they were exactly what they sound like, heavy metal-tipped projectiles that families threw across the yard at a plastic ring target while kids ran through the landing zone. Each dart weighed about 1/4 pound, with a pointed steel tip sharp enough to pierce lawn soil on impact. They were sold as a family backyard game by manufacturers, including Regent Sports, packaged alongside badminton sets at Sears and Kmart. The Consumer Product Safety Commission received reports of over 6,000 emergency room visits related to lawn darts between 1970 and 1987. In 1987, a 7-year-old named Michelle Snow was struck in the head by a dart at a family gathering in Riverside, California, and died 3 days later. Her father launched a campaign that led to a full federal ban in 1988. For nearly 2 decades before that, your grandparents handed these to kids at cookouts and called it recreation. If lawn darts were dangerous because of what they could do to a body, Macramé was dangerous because of what it did to a home. By the mid-1970s, every room in suburban America was strangled in knotted rope. Macramé plant holders dangled from ceilings. Macramé owl wall hangings stared from every den with blank, judgmental eyes. Macramé bedspreads covered beds in scratchy beige hostility. The craft had existed for centuries, but the 70s turned it into a decorating obsession fueled by how-to books and craft store workshops. The material collected dust like a filter, dried out in the sun, and became brittle enough to snap under the weight of a potted fern, dropping ceramic and soil onto whatever sat below. Nobody considered the fire risk of hanging dried fraying rope next to a light bulb that ran hot. Your grandparents did not have one piece. They had a dozen, and everyone looked like something a sailor made during a nervous breakdown. In the 1970s, someone convinced millions of Americans that the ideal place to sleep was on a giant vinyl bag filled with several 100 pounds of water, sitting on a wooden frame in a second-floor bedroom. Waterbeds were marketed as luxurious, even therapeutic. Manufacturers claimed they relieved back pain and improved sleep. What they actually provided was seasickness, condensation, and the constant low-grade anxiety of knowing a single puncture could flood the bedroom in minutes. The vinyl had to be filled with a garden hose, treated with chemical conditioner to prevent algae, and heated with an electric pad to avoid sleeping on a cold, sloshing surface. Moving one required draining hundreds of gallons. Insurance companies began adding exclusions to homeowner policies specifically because of waterbed damage claims. They were never banned, never recalled, and never made a single back feel better. They just quietly disappeared by the late 1980s, leaving warped floorboards behind. It was completely legal in every state during the 1970s for kids to ride unsecured in the open bed of a moving pickup truck. Your grandparents did not think twice about it. On farm visits, camping trips, and runs to the swimming hole, kids piled into the truck bed. They sat on the wheel wells or the tailgate, gripped the side rails, and held on while the truck reached highway speed. There were no enclosures, no tie-downs, no restraints. A sudden stop, a sharp turn, or a pothole at the wrong angle could send a child over the side and onto the road. The Centers for Disease Control documented hundreds of fatalities from truck bed ejections throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, but federal regulation was slow. Even today, several states still have no law prohibiting kids from riding in an open truck bed. The practice has not been fully banned nationwide. It just gradually became the kind of thing people stopped doing once they understood what a 50-mile-per-hour fall onto pavement actually meant. Before caller ID, before voicemail, Before the concept of a private phone call, your grandparents shared their telephone line with the neighbors. A party line meant that multiple households were connected to the same circuit, and anyone on that circuit could pick up and listen to anyone else's conversation at any time. The phone itself was a rotary dial model, usually wall-mounted in the kitchen, with a coiled cord that stretched just far enough to drag into the hallway for a whisper of privacy, while your mother yelled at you to get off the line. Dialing a long-distance number meant waiting for each digit to click slowly back into position. A wrong number meant starting over. And if a neighbor was already talking, you hung up and waited, or you stayed on and eavesdropped, which everyone denied doing, and everyone absolutely did. AT&T phased out most party lines by the early 1980s, but in rural areas, shared lines survived into the 90s. Lava lamps were the mood lighting of the 1970s, and almost nobody knew what was actually inside them. The original design, patented by British inventor Edward Craven Walker and licensed for American production through his company Crestworth, contained paraffin wax floating in a mixture that often included carbon tetrachloride, a solvent the EPA later classified as a probable human carcinogen. The bulb at the base heated the wax until it rose in slow, hypnotic blobs, and the glass got hot enough to burn skin on contact. Cracking or breaking the lamp released liquid that was not meant to be inhaled or touched. Later models replaced the toxic solvents with safer alternatives, but throughout the 70s, millions of the original formulations sat in bedrooms and living rooms across America, glowing softly while slowly off-gassing. They were never recalled. No warning label appeared on the glass. Your grandparents just thought they looked groovy. A jewelry inventor named Josh Reynolds introduced the mood ring in 1975, and within months, Americans were making medical decisions based on the color of a cheap metal band. The ring contained a capsule of thermotropic liquid crystals that changed color in response to body temperature, not emotion, not stress, not spiritual energy, just heat. Blue supposedly meant calm. Black meant anxious. Green meant normal. Reynolds sold millions, initially pricing them as high as $45 for the silver versions before knockoffs flooded the market at $2 a piece. The liquid crystals had a fatal design flaw. Exposure to water or moisture caused them to fail permanently, locking the ring on black regardless of temperature. Within 2 years, every mood ring in America had gone dark. Your grandparents wore one to parties, checked the color before making plans, and genuinely believed a piece of costume jewelry could read their emotional state better than they could. In the early 1970s, hitchhiking was not considered dangerous. It was considered transportation. Teenagers stuck out their thumbs on rural highways and got rides to school, to work, to the next town. College students hitched across state lines during summer breaks. Parents waved goodbye and expected them home by dinner. A 1972 Gallup poll found that a significant percentage of Americans under 30 had hitchhiked at least once, and counterculture circles openly encouraged the practice as a rejection of consumerism. A series of high-profile abductions and murders involving hitchhikers, including cases linked to Edmund Kemper along California highways, shifted public perception rapidly. By the late 70s, hitchhiking had gone from casual to terrifying in the American imagination. Your grandparents hitched rides freely in 1971. By 1979, they would not let their own kids accept a ride from a stranger. Sunscreen existed in the 1970s, but your grandparents did not use it. They used the opposite. Baby oil, pure mineral oil, sometimes mixed with iodine for a deeper tan, was the sunbathing product of choice, and it worked by essentially eliminating any barrier between ultraviolet radiation and bare skin. The sun protection factor concept had been developed by Franz Greiter in 1962, but commercial sunscreens in the 70s topped out around sun protection factor 2 or 4, which blocked almost nothing. Most people skipped them entirely. The routine was simple. Coat yourself in oil, lie on a reflective aluminum blanket, roast until your skin turned red, peel, repeat the next weekend. Kids were coated in the same oil and sent outside for hours with no hat and no shade. A 1978 study in the Archives of Dermatology warned that repeated sunburn in childhood dramatically increased melanoma risk later in life. Nobody read it. Your grandparents just called it getting some color. The parenting philosophy of the 1970s could be summarized in 5 words. Be home before the streetlights. Your grandparents sent kids out after breakfast with no itinerary, no supervision, and no way to reach them. A typical summer day meant biking 3 miles from home, building forts in the woods out of scrap lumber and rusty nails, catching crawfish in drainage ditches, and eating lunch at whichever friend's house was closest. Parents had no expectation of knowing their kids' location until the streetlights flickered on at dusk, the universal curfew signal. A 12-year-old might supervise 8-year-olds at the creek. A 10-year-old might wander a construction site alone. Nobody called the authorities. The neighborhood operated on the assumption that somebody's mother was probably watching from a window, and that assumption was almost never correct. The conversation pit was the architectural crown jewel of the 1970s, a sunken seating area 2 or 3 steps below the main floor, centered around a fireplace and surrounded by built-in cushioned benches. The idea was that guests would descend into the room for intimate face-to-face conversation. The reality was that anyone carrying a drink or walking through a dimly lit room could step off the edge and fall into a pit lined with shag carpet and other people. There were no railings, no warning strips, no transition markers, just a sudden drop where the floor used to be. After a few cocktails, the ankle trap became obvious. Home insurance claims for sunken living room falls increased through the decade, and today, contractors fill them in to create level flooring, erasing the feature designed to bring people together, but mostly just bringing them down. The toy was called click-clacks. It was 2 hard acrylic balls attached to a string with a ring in the middle. You held the ring, swung the balls, and tried to make them clack together above and below your hand in a rapid rhythm. The problem was that the acrylic shattered. Under repeated impact stress, the balls cracked and sent sharp plastic fragments flying outward like shrapnel. The FDA received enough injury reports to classify click-clacks as a mechanical hazard, effectively banning the original acrylic version in 1971. Manufacturers responded by switching to slightly less explosive plastic, and the toy kept selling throughout the decade. Your grandparents bought them at the 5 and dime and let kids swing heavy balls inches from their faces for hours. The bruised knuckles and flying debris were considered part of the fun. For about 10 cents at any corner store, your grandparents could buy their 6-year-old a pack of candy cigarettes that looked exactly like the real thing. The packaging mimicked actual brands: Lucky Strikes, Marlboro, Winston, with only slight name changes to dodge trademark lawsuits. The candy sticks were dusted in powdered sugar so that when a child blew on the end, a puff of white powder floated out like smoke. Some versions were bubblegum, others were chocolate wrapped in paper. All of them taught kids to hold a cylinder between 2 fingers, bring it to their lips, and pretend to inhale. A 1990 study in the journal Pediatrics found that kids who consumed candy cigarettes were significantly more likely to try real tobacco later. The product was never banned at the federal level and is technically still sold today. The going rate for babysitting in the 1970s was about 50 cents an hour, and the sitter was almost certainly a 12-year-old from the next block. No background check, no CPR certification, no first aid training, no emergency plan beyond a phone number scribbled on a notepad by the rotary phone. Your grandparents left their toddlers with a 7th grader, handed her cash for pizza, pointed to the liquor cabinet she was not supposed to open, and drove to a dinner party that ran until midnight. Some of these kids watched 3 or 4 younger ones at once. Some were responsible for infants overnight. The Red Cross did not begin its formal babysitting certification course until 1979. For most of the decade, the only qualification was living nearby and being tall enough to reach the stove. The chemistry sets sold to kids in the 1970s contained chemicals that would require a hazardous materials license today. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, marketed in the 1950s and still circulating secondhand into the 1970s, included actual uranium ore and a Geiger counter to measure radiation. Standard sets from Skillcraft and Porter Chemcraft included potassium permanganate, which caused chemical burns on skin contact. They also contained sodium ferrocyanide and acids strong enough to eat through fabric. The instruction booklets treated minor explosions as educational outcomes. Kids ran experiments in bedrooms with no ventilation, no goggles, and no adult in the room. Broken thermometers provided bonus entertainment. Kids rolled liquid mercury across tabletops with bare hands, fascinated by the shiny metal that was slowly poisoning them. Your grandparents wrapped these sets in birthday paper and called it encouraging a love of science. No trespassing signs in the 1970s were not warnings. They were invitations. Every kid knew where the nearest construction site was, and on weekends when the crews went home, those sites became the best playground in town. Unfinished houses had exposed framing to climb, open floor joists to balance on, and piles of lumber with protruding nails that could punch through a sneaker. Ditches held standing water mixed with concrete runoff. Rebar stuck up from foundations at knee height. Stacks of drywall and cinder blocks became forts and spaceships. Injuries were hidden from parents with creative cover stories because admitting where you had been meant losing access. Tetanus was a real risk. The rusty nails and scrap metal were textbook vectors for Clostridium tetani. Your grandparents knew their kids played outside. They did not know they played inside half-built structures where one wrong step meant a fall onto raw concrete. In 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries declared an oil embargo against the United States, and overnight, the country that ran on gasoline discovered it could not get any. Lines at gas stations stretched around blocks, sometimes lasting 3 hours, with drivers idling and burning the very fuel they were waiting to buy. Fistfights broke out at pumps. Some stations ran dry by mid-morning. State governments implemented odd-even rationing. If your plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-number days. President Nixon signed the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act in 1974, setting a nationwide speed limit of 55 miles per hour that lasted over 2 decades. Your grandparents sat in those lines with the engine running. Kids bounced around the back seat, windows down, because the air conditioning burned too much fuel. They were waiting to fill a tank in a country that had never imagined the pumps could go empty. They did all of it with a smile and called it common sense. Like and subscribe for more things your parents never warned you about.